She stood there in the rain, soaking wet, clutching $100 bill her ex-husband had thrown on the floor like trash. After 14 years of marriage, this was what she was worth to him. $75,000 and his mockery echoing in her ears. You'll be working retail within a year. You're nothing without me. But what Brandon didn't know, what nobody knew, was the secret Claire was hiding beneath her loose clothing. A secret that could destroy everything she'd just fought for. A secret that made her hands shake as she signed those divorce papers. And then, just when she thought she'd hit rock bottom, a black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. A professional driver stepped out with an umbrella and said 5 words that changed everything. "Mr. Garrison sent me for you." Brandon watched from the lobby window, his face going pale as his ex-wife, the woman he'd just humiliated, was treated like royalty by a billionaire he didn't even know existed. What happens next? How does a pregnant woman with nothing but $75,000 take on a narcissistic millionaire who wants to destroy her? And who is this mysterious billionaire who's been waiting 15 years for his chance? Stay with me, because this story has more twists than you can imagine. If you love stories about women who refuse to stay down, who fight back with intelligence instead of just tears, then you're going to want to hear every single word of what happens next. And hey, if you're already hooked, show me by hitting that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me if you've ever had to hide something to protect yourself. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about real strength. And subscribe because, trust me, you won't want to miss how this ends. Now let's go back to where it all began. Claire Bennett stared at the pregnancy test in her trembling hands, watching the second pink line darken with each passing second. Positive. She was 14 weeks pregnant with her soon-to-be ex-husband's child, and he could never, ever know. Not yet. Maybe not ever. From the bedroom, Brandon's voice cut through the morning air like a knife. "Claire, where the hell is my blue tie? The Armani one. I have the Caldwell meeting in 40 minutes. She shoved the test deep into the tampon box under the sink, her heart hammering against her ribs. 14 weeks. She'd suspected for a month but kept putting off the test, hoping somehow she was wrong. Now the evidence sat hidden in her bathroom, a ticking time bomb that could destroy everything. "Coming," she called out, forcing her voice to sound normal. Claire caught her reflection in the mirror as she stood. 36 years old, dark circles under her eyes from weeks of sleepless nights, her face thinner than it had been in years. She'd lost 12 pounds from stress since filing for divorce 3 weeks ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was growing a human being while watching her marriage die. She pulled on a loose cardigan over her pajamas and walked into the bedroom they still shared, though Brandon had been sleeping on the couch for weeks. He stood in front of his closet, expensive suits lined up like soldiers awaiting deployment. "It's at the dry cleaners," Claire said quietly. "You dropped it off Tuesday, remember?" Brandon turned, his handsome face twisting into that familiar look of contempt she'd grown to recognize over the past 2 years. "Of course you'd forget to pick it up. What exactly do you do all day, Claire, besides plan how to take half my money?" She bit back the response that burned on her tongue. She'd spent the morning researching custody laws, learning that if he knew about the pregnancy before the divorce was finalized, he could use it as leverage. He could drag out the proceedings for months, maybe years. He could claim she was unstable, unfit, trying to trap him. So she said nothing, just turned and walked back to the bathroom, locking the door behind her. 2 hours later, Claire sat in a gleaming conference room on the 52nd floor of a Manhattan office building, her hands folded carefully in her lap to hide their shaking. Across from her, Brandon lounged in his chair like he owned the world. Maybe he did own a piece of it. His real estate development company had certainly made him wealthy enough. Jessica Martinez, Claire's divorce attorney, sat beside her, reviewing papers with the grim expression of someone who knew they were fighting a losing battle. On Brandon's side, Diane Porter, whose hourly rate was $1,500, smiled with the serene confidence of a shark circling wounded prey. "Shall we begin?" Diane said, sliding a stack of documents across the polished mahogany table. "The settlement terms are quite generous, Ms. Bennett. $75,000. Plus you keep your personal vehicle and whatever possessions you brought into the marriage." Claire stared at the number, $75,000. After 14 years of marriage, 14 years of managing his household, hosting his business dinners, giving up her career as an art authentication specialist to support his ambitions. That's not even half of what Jessica started. That's what the prenuptial agreement stipulates, Diane interrupted smoothly. Ms. Bennett signed it quite willingly in 2010. I have the notarized copy right here. Claire remembered that day. She'd been 22, so in love she could barely see straight. Brandon had presented the prenup 2 days before the wedding, at dinner, telling her it was just a formality. His lawyer had been there, a different one, older, since retired. She'd signed without reading it carefully, convinced it didn't matter because they'd be together forever. And here, Diane continued, flipping to a specific page, Ms. Bennett waives all future claims to assets acquired during the marriage. This includes any potential children from the marriage, should any exist. Claire's hand moved involuntarily to her stomach, then stopped. She forced it back to the table. Across from her, Brandon was watching with those cold blue eyes that had once made her heart race. Sign here, Ms. Bennett, Diane said, indicating the signature line. You're confirming you have no children from this marriage and waive any future claims. The words seemed to echo in the silent room. No children from this marriage. But she did. She had a 10-week-old fetus growing inside her right now, Brandon's biological child, and if she signed this paper, Jessica leaned close, whispering in her ear, Are you absolutely certain about this? If there's anything you need to tell me, I'm sure, Claire whispered back. Because if she told the truth now, Brandon would use it to destroy her. She'd seen how he operated in business, how he crushed people who stood in his way. She wouldn't let him do that to her child. She picked up the expensive pen Diane had provided and signed her name. Claire Marie Bennett, soon to be just Claire Marie Fisher, once the paperwork went through. Brandon leaned back in his chair, a smile playing at his lips. You know what your problem is, Claire? You think you're smart. You think those boring little art details you used to obsess over actually matter in the real world. But you're nothing without me. You'll be living in Queens within a year, probably working retail at some museum gift shop. The words struck like physical blows, but Claire kept her face neutral. She'd learned that skill over the past 2 years, the art of showing nothing while dying inside. Brandon stood, buttoning his $8,000 Tom Ford suit. Oh, and that little art blog you've been running. I checked the analytics. You have 11 followers. 11. My dog's Instagram has 5,000. He laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Face it, Claire. You're going back to being nobody. At least when you were my wife, you were somebody's wife. Jessica started to object, but Claire put a hand on her arm. Let him have his moment. Let him think he'd won, because hidden beneath her loose blouse was the one thing he didn't know about, the one piece of leverage he couldn't take away. Their baby, growing quietly, secretly, beyond his reach, for now. The rain hit Claire like a slap when she stepped out of the building 30 minutes later. Of course it was raining. Of course her umbrella was in Brandon's car. Of course her phone, still on Brandon's family plan, had no service because he'd already canceled it. She stood under the building's awning, watching black cars and yellow taxis slide past in the downpour. Her bank account held exactly $1,247. Brandon had cleaned out their joint account the day she'd filed for divorce, taking everything except what the law required him to leave. The nausea hit suddenly, the way it had been hitting all week. Morning sickness, except it wasn't limited to mornings. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth and rushed back inside, barely making it to the lobby bathroom before she threw up. When she emerged 5 minutes later, pale and shaking, she found Brandon standing near the elevator bay. He was on his phone, speaker turned up loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. Is it done, baby? The voice was female, young, sultry, Amber Sullivan, the 28-year-old fitness influencer Brandon had been sleeping with for the past 6 months. Signed, sealed, delivered, Brandon said, not bothering to lower his voice. She practically thanked me for the 75 grand. Didn't even fight. Oh, poor thing, Amber cooed, though there was laughter in her voice. What's she going to do now? Who cares? She's not my problem anymore. Claire stood frozen by the bathroom door, watching him. Brandon saw her, met her eyes, and smiled. He wanted her to hear this, wanted her to know that he'd already moved on, already replaced her with a younger, prettier version. He ended the call and walked toward her, pulling out his wallet. From the expensive leather, he extracted a crisp $100 bill and held it out. "For a cab," he said, "or the subway. Better get used to public transportation." Claire stared at the money. Taking it would be admitting defeat, acknowledging that she needed his charity, but she also needed to get home, needed to see her doctor, needed to figure out her next move. She took the bill. Brandon smiled wider. "That's what I thought. You always were practical, Claire. It's your only redeeming quality." He dropped the money on the floor, the gleaming marble lobby floor of this exclusive building, and walked away toward the elevator. Claire stood there for a long moment, watching the $100 bill flutter slightly in the air conditioning. Around her, people in expensive suits pretended not to notice. The receptionist, a young woman named Vanessa with ice in her eyes, watched with barely concealed contempt. Finally, Claire bent down to pick up the money. As she did, she felt her hand move instinctively to protect her stomach, cradling the small curve that was just starting to show under her loose clothing. Brandon, already stepping into the elevator, saw the gesture. His eyes narrowed slightly, but then the doors closed, and he was gone. Claire straightened up, clutching the $100 bill in her fist. She walked toward the building's glass doors, ready to step out into the rain and figure out how to get home to Queens with no phone and limited cash. That's when the car pulled up. It was a black Mercedes S-Class, sleek and expensive, but not ostentatious. Not Brandon's style. He preferred Italian sports cars, machines that screamed wealth and power. This car whispered it instead. The rear door opened, and a man in a professional chauffeur's uniform stepped out, holding a large black umbrella. He was in his 50s, dignified, with kind eyes. "Ms. Bennett?" he said. Claire froze. I'm sorry, I think you have the wrong person." "Ms. Claire Marie Fisher, formerly Bennett," the man said gently. "Mr. Garrison sent me. He asked me to make sure you got home safely." The name hit her like a thunderbolt. Garrison. Michael Garrison. "I don't understand," Claire said. "I haven't spoken to Michael in 15 years. The chauffeur smiled. "He knows. He wanted you to know he remembers." He held up the umbrella higher. "Please, Ms. Bennett. It's quite cold, and you're getting wet." Behind her, through the lobby's glass walls, Claire could see Brandon. He'd come back down, probably to gloat some more or retrieve something from his lawyer. He stood frozen near the elevator, staring out at the scene on the street, at Claire, at the Mercedes, at the professional driver treating her like she mattered. His face had gone pale, all the smug confidence draining away like water from a broken glass. Claire looked at the chauffeur, at the warm, dry car, at the escape route being offered. Then she looked back at Brandon, still frozen in the lobby. She smiled. A real smile, the first in months. "Thank you," she said to the chauffeur. "I'd appreciate the ride very much." James, that was the name embroidered on his uniform, helped her into the back seat. The car smelled like leather and subtle cologne, nothing like Brandon's aggressive designer sense. On the seat beside her lay a small envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. Through the car's tinted windows, Claire watched Brandon burst out of the building, rain immediately soaking his expensive suit. He stared at the car, at her, his mouth working soundlessly. The Mercedes pulled smoothly into traffic, leaving him standing there in the rain. Claire picked up the envelope with trembling fingers and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note on heavy cream cardstock. "Claire, I heard about your divorce through public records. I don't know your situation, but I remember who you were before him. If you need anything, and I mean anything, call this number. No strings, no expectations. Just an old friend who never forgot." Michael, below the message, was a phone number written in the same elegant script. Claire held the note, watching the rain streak down the window as Manhattan blurred past. Her hand moved to her stomach, to the secret growing there, to the future she had to protect. In her pocket, Brandon's $100 bill felt like an insult. In her hand, Michael's note felt like a lifeline. She didn't know yet which one she'd use, but for the first time in 2 years, Claire Bennett felt something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. 3 days after the divorce signing, Claire stood in her studio apartment in Astoria, Queens, surrounded by moving boxes that she couldn't afford to fully unpack. The place was small, 400 square feet that cost $2,200 a month, but it was hers. No more walking on eggshells. No more hiding who she was to make Brandon feel bigger. She sat on the edge of her second-hand bed and stared at the note from Michael Garrison for the 100th time. The paper had grown soft from handling, the elegant handwriting as familiar as if she'd just seen it yesterday instead of 15 years ago. Her laptop sat open on the cardboard box she was using as a nightstand. She'd been researching him for the past 3 nights, unable to sleep, her mind racing with questions and what-ifs. Michael Garrison, 45 years old, tech billionaire who'd made his fortune developing authentication software for digital art and NFTs. But his real passion, according to every article she'd read, was traditional art. He sat on the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He'd donated $50 million to create a new wing for Renaissance paintings at the Guggenheim. And last year, he'd announced plans to open his own museum, the Garrison Collection, dedicated to recovered and authenticated masterworks. The photos showed a man who'd aged well, still tall and lean, with kind eyes behind expensive glasses, silver threading through his dark hair, laugh lines around his mouth. In every photo at gallery openings or museum galas, he stood slightly apart from the crowds, observing rather than performing. Claire closed the laptop and picked up her phone, a cheap prepaid model she'd bought the day after the divorce. Her real phone, with all her contacts and photos, sat dead in a drawer. Brandon had killed the service within hours of her signing the papers. She'd lost so much already. Her marriage, her home, her identity as Mrs. Brandon Bennett. Soon she'd start showing, and then she'd have to explain to everyone that she was pregnant with her ex-husband's child. The shame of it made her sick. But the baby inside her deserved better than shame, deserved better than a mother who hid and feared. Claire looked at Michael's number one more time. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she dialed. He answered on the first ring. Claire. Just her name. Not a question, not a greeting, a statement. Like he'd been waiting for her call, expecting it, maybe even hoping for it. How did you know it was me? Her voice came out shakier than she intended. This is a prepaid phone. You couldn't have... I gave that number to one person, Michael said gently. It only goes to me. When it rang, I knew. Claire pressed her free hand to her mouth, fighting unexpected tears. When was the last time someone had anticipated her needs instead of her having to beg for scraps of attention? I need advice, she said. Not money, not charity. Just, I need someone to tell me if I'm crazy for what I'm thinking about doing. I'm listening. I'm 11 weeks pregnant. The words tumbled out in a rush. The baby is Brandon's. He doesn't know. Nobody knows except my doctor and now you. I hid it during the divorce proceedings because if he'd found out, he would have used it to destroy me. Silence on the other end. Not the cold silence of judgment, but the warm silence of someone absorbing information, thinking carefully before responding. What do you need? Michael finally asked. I need to know if I'm a terrible person for keeping this secret. I need to know if there's any possible way this doesn't end in disaster. Her voice broke. I need someone to tell me I'm going to be okay. Meet me tomorrow, Michael said. Do you remember the Met, the Dutch Masters wing? Claire's breath caught. That's where we first met. 15 years ago, you were standing in front of the Vermeer, young woman with a water pitcher. You stood there for 20 minutes just looking. I thought you were the most beautiful thing in the room. She remembered that day with perfect clarity. She'd been 21, fresh out of art school, working as a junior authentication specialist at a small gallery. The Met was her sanctuary, the place she went to remember why she loved art. She'd been studying the Vermeer, lost in the perfect composition, when she'd felt someone watching her. When she'd turned, she'd seen him. Tall, kind-eyed, slightly nervous. He'd smiled, opened his mouth to say something, and then Brandon had appeared. Brandon with his confident swagger and expensive suit in immediate, overwhelming attention. Brandon who'd seen Michael looking at her and made his move first, sweeping her away to dinner and the opera, and a whirlwind romance that had felt like destiny. I remember, Claire whispered into the phone, 2 o'clock tomorrow. We'll talk. Just talk. After she hung up, Claire sat in her tiny apartment and cried. Not sad tears, not happy tears, something in between. Relief maybe, or hope, or just the overwhelming emotion of being seen as a person instead of a problem. The next afternoon, Claire stood in front of the Vermeer painting, exactly where she'd been 15 years ago. The museum was relatively quiet for a Thursday. Tourists scattered through the galleries, their voices echoing off marble floors. She'd agonized over what to wear, finally settling on loose-fitting black pants and a flowing tunic that hid her small bump. 11 weeks. Soon she'd be in her second trimester, and hiding the pregnancy would become impossible. "You're early." Michael's voice came from behind her, soft and warm. Claire turned and found herself face to face with the man she'd almost gone to dinner with 15 years ago. He looked exactly like his photos. Better even. There was a kindness in his eyes that cameras couldn't capture, a gentleness in his smile that made her feel safe for the first time in months. "I'm always early for museums," Claire said. "Retail habit from art school. Get there before the crowds." Michael smiled. "I remember, you told me that. Right here, actually. Before," he trailed off, "before Brandon showed up." They stood in awkward silence for a moment, two people who'd shared 5 minutes of connection 15 years ago and nothing since. "Fun. I was going to ask you to dinner that night," Michael said quietly. "I'd worked up the courage, spent 20 minutes watching you study that painting, trying to think of something clever to say. Then he appeared and I watched him charm you away in about 90 seconds. Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was very good at charming. "I checked, after I looked you up on social media, saw your engagement photos 6 months later. You looked happy in them. I told myself I'd missed my chance and that was okay because you'd found someone who made you smile like that." "I thought I was happy." Claire turned back to the Vermeer, unable to meet his eyes. "He made me feel special, important, like I mattered. It wasn't until later that I realized feeling special to Brandon meant making myself smaller so he could be bigger." Michael moved to stand beside her, both of them facing the painting. Not touching, not crowding her space, just present. "Tell me about the pregnancy," he said. So she did. She told him everything. About the morning sickness that had started at 6 weeks, about the doctor's appointment where she'd confirmed it, about the agonizing decision to hide it from Brandon during the divorce, about signing papers that waived claims to future children, while knowing her child was already 10 weeks old. "Did I commit fraud?" Claire asked when she finished. "Jessica, my lawyer, she kept giving me these looks like she knew I was hiding something. If Brandon finds out, can he use this against me?" Michael was quiet for a moment, studying the painting. "May I ask you something personal? After what I just told you, I don't think anything is off limits. Why did you hide it? Really, I understand the strategic reasons, but what was the emotional reason?" Claire's hand moved to her stomach, protective. "Because if he knew, he'd try to take this baby from me. Not because he wants to be a father. Brandon has made it very clear he doesn't want children. But because taking the baby would hurt me, and hurting me would give him power. Then you did the right thing. Even if it was technically fraud." Michael turned to look at her fully. "Claire, I'm not a lawyer, but I am someone who spent 20 years building security systems, thinking about how people protect what matters to them. You protected your child. That's not fraud. That's survival." The validation hit her like a wave. She'd spent 3 weeks second-guessing herself, wondering if she was a horrible person for lying. Hearing someone else say she'd done the right thing made something tight in her chest finally loosen. "I can't raise a baby on $75,000, she said. "I did the math. Rent, medical bills, childcare. I'll be broke in 18 months. I can't get hired as an authentication specialist while I'm visibly pregnant. No one wants to deal with maternity leave from a new employee. I'm trapped." "What if you weren't?" Michael asked. Claire looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I'm opening a museum, the Garrison Collection. We're acquiring pieces from private collectors, estates, disputed provenance cases. I need someone who can authenticate them, research their histories, verify their legitimacy." "Michael, I haven't worked in 8 years. I'm rusty. I'm pregnant. I'm not..." He pulled out his phone and showed her a screenshot. It was from Reddit, posted under the username ArtDetective47. A detailed analysis of a supposed Caravaggio painting, breaking down why it was a forgery based on brushstroke patterns, pigment analysis, and compositional anomalies. Claire felt her face flush. How did you find that? I've been following your work for years. This post saved a collector $12 million. They were about to buy this painting from a very reputable dealer. Your analysis stopped the sale. That was just a hobby. I do it for fun, not professionally. Claire. Michael put his phone away and met her eyes. I'm not offering you charity. I'm offering you a job you're overqualified for. Senior Authentication Specialist, $175,000 a year. Full medical benefits, maternity leave, and you never have to see Brandon again. The number made her dizzy, $175,000. She'd never made more than $40,000 at her old job. Why, she whispered. Why would you do this for me? Because 15 years ago, I watched you study a painting with such joy and passion that I fell a little bit in love with you in that moment. Then I watched you marry someone else and convinced myself I was fine with it. But I never stopped following your work, never stopped wondering what you were capable of if someone actually appreciated your talent instead of diminishing it. He took a step back, giving her space. This is a real job offer, Claire, not a romantic gesture, not pity. I need someone with your skills, and you need a stable income to protect your child. We can help each other. Claire looked at the Vermeer painting. Young woman, water pitcher, perfect morning light, a moment of peace captured forever. When would I start? She asked. Michael smiled. How about Monday? The next 3 weeks felt like living in a dream. Claire started at the Garrison Collections Authentication Lab in Chelsea, working with a small team of specialists in a bright, modern space filled with paintings waiting to reveal their secrets. She was good at this, better than good. The skills she'd thought she'd lost came flooding back. The ability to read brushstrokes like handwriting, to spot anachronistic materials, to trace the provenance of a piece through layers of history and forgery. Her colleagues treated her with respect. Her boss, a jovial art historian named Thomas Sullivan, praised her work openly. And Michael kept a professional distance but checked in regularly, asking about her progress, her comfort, whether she needed anything. At 13 weeks pregnant, Claire finally started to show. Not obviously, just a small curve that she could hide under loose blouses. But it was there, a physical reminder that time was running out on her secret. She'd moved to a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a safer neighborhood, affordable on her new salary. She'd had her first ultrasound with sound, lying alone in the examination room while the technician showed her the flickering heartbeat on the screen. Would you like to know the sex? The technician had asked. Not yet, Claire had whispered, tears streaming down her face. I want to be surprised. For the first time since filing for divorce, Claire felt like she could breathe. Like maybe, just maybe, she could pull this off. Raise her child alone, build a career, create a life that didn't involve walking on eggshells or making herself smaller to fit someone else's ego. She should have known it wouldn't last. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday evening. Claire was working late at the lab, examining a disputed Rembrandt, when her personal phone buzzed. The prepaid phone that only a handful of people had the number to. Unknown caller. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello? Heavy breathing on the other end. Then, still working late, I see. Some things never change. Claire's blood turned to ice. Brandon. Miss me. His voice was smooth, amused, like this was all a game. You're hard to track him down these days, Claire. New phone number, new address, very mysterious. How did you get this number? I have my ways. Did you really think you could just disappear? We were married for 14 years. I know you better than you know yourself. Claire's hand instinctively moved to her stomach. What do you want? Just checking in, making sure my ex-wife is doing okay. I heard you got a fancy new job. Authentication specialist at the Garrison Collection. Impressive. Must be nice having a sugar daddy. Michael is my boss, that's all. Brandon laughed. Sure he is. You always were naive, Claire. Men like Garrison don't hire women like you out of the goodness of their hearts. But hey, do what you need to do. I'm certainly not judging. I have to go. You look different, Brandon said. I saw you last week, walking into your building. You've gained weight, glowing even. Stress eating? Or is there just something you want to tell me? Claire's heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. He'd been watching her, following her. Stay away from me, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The divorce is final. You have no reason to... the divorce is final when I say it's final. We were married for 14 years, Claire. You really think I'm just going to let you walk away? Start over like I never existed? What do you want? Nothing yet. Just wanted you to know I'm still here, still watching, still part of your life whether you like it or not. He hung up. Claire stood in the empty lab, phone clutched in her shaking hand, and felt the dream begin to crumble. The second sign came 3 days later. Claire arrived at her apartment building after work to find her door slightly ajar. She'd locked it that morning. She was obsessive about locks now, checking them twice before leaving. Someone had been inside. Her heart racing, she pushed the door open slowly. Everything looked normal at first. Then she noticed the small details. Her laptop moved slightly to the left on her desk. A kitchen drawer not quite closed. Her bedroom closet door open when she always kept it shut. Nothing taken, nothing obviously disturbed. Just enough to let her know I was here. I can get to you whenever I want. Claire called the building super, a gruff man named Eddie, who'd seemed friendly when she'd moved in. You sure you locked it? He asked, looking at the door with disinterest. I'm certain. Lock looks fine to me. Maybe you just forgot. Pregnancy brain, right? Claire froze. I'm sorry, what? Eddie shrugged. My wife had it when she was expecting. Forgot stuff all the time. You're, what, 3, 4 months along? I'm not pregnant, Claire lied, her voice barely steady. Sure, whatever you say. Eddie smiled in a way that made her skin crawl. I'll check the security cameras, but they've been on the fritz lately. Probably won't show anything. After he left, Claire sat on her bed and tried not to panic. Eddie knew. Somehow Brandon had gotten to him, paid him off, asked him to report back. Her secret was leaking out. Soon everyone would know. The third sign came a week later, and it shattered everything. Claire was working in her apartment, 14 weeks pregnant, and finally relaxing into a Saturday morning when her doorbell rang. She checked the peephole out of habit. Brandon. Her breath stopped. He was standing in her hallway, expensive suit perfectly pressed, holding what looked like flowers. Behind him, she could see Eddie the super, hovering nervously. I know you're home, Claire, Brandon called through the door. The lights are on. We need to talk. Go away or I'm calling the police. About what? Coming to check on my ex-wife? That's not illegal. He held up the flowers. I brought a peace offering. Just want to talk. 5 minutes. Claire kept the chain on and opened the door a crack. Say what you need to say from there. Brandon's smile was all teeth. You look good, Claire. Really good. Different somehow. Healthier. If that's all, when were you going to tell me? Tell you what? Brandon's eyes dropped deliberately to her stomach. Even with the door mostly closed, even in her oversized sweatshirt, she knew he could see the curve. That you're pregnant with my child. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I'm not. Don't lie to me. Brandon's voice went cold. I've had you followed for 2 weeks. I have photos of you at the OBGYN. I have your medical records. Don't look so shocked. Eddie here has been very helpful. You're 14 weeks along, which means you were pregnant when you signed the divorce papers. Claire felt the walls closing in. Leave now. Brandon pushed against the door. The chain held, but barely. You committed fraud, Claire. You signed documents stating you had no children from our marriage. You waived future claims knowing you were carrying my baby. That's illegal. Get out or I'm calling. Call whoever you want. But first, let me tell you what's going to happen. Brandon pulled out his phone and pulled up a document. This is a petition for emergency custody. I'm filing it Monday morning. I'm going to tell the judge that you're mentally unstable. You hid a pregnancy during divorce proceedings. You're working for some billionaire you barely know under suspicious circumstances. You're living alone in this dump, clearly unable to provide a stable environment. You can't. I can and I will. And when our baby is born, I'm taking it. and I'm giving it to Amber to raise. She'll be a wonderful mother. You'll be a visiting stranger if you're lucky. Every other weekend, supervised visits, assuming you can prove you're not a danger to yourself or the child. Claire's knees went weak. She grabbed the door frame to stay upright. Brandon leaned closer to the crack in the door. This is what happens when you try to outsmart me, Claire. I always win. Always. You should have learned that by now. He dropped the flowers on the floor and walked away. Claire closed the door, slid the deadbolt, and collapsed. Her hands shook so violently she could barely dial her phone. Jessica answered on the second ring. Claire, what's wrong? He knows, Claire gasped. Brandon knows about the baby. He's filing for custody. He's going to take my child away from me. Slow down. Tell me exactly what happened. Claire told her everything. The surveillance, the break-in, Eddie's betrayal, Brandon's threats. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Claire, Jessica said finally, her voice gentle but grave. He has a case. You did hide the pregnancy during the divorce. A judge could see that as evidence of instability or deception. I was protecting myself. I believe you, but we need proof. Do you have any evidence of abuse, threatening texts, emails, anything that shows why you felt you needed to hide the pregnancy? Claire thought of all the times Brandon had belittled her, controlled her, made her feel worthless. But she'd never documented it. She'd just endured it, thinking that was what marriage meant. No, she whispered, I have nothing. Then we're going to have a very difficult fight ahead of us. After she hung up with Jessica, Claire sat in her apartment and felt the walls close in. She'd thought she was free, thought she was safe, thought she could build a new life. But Brandon had always been one step ahead, and now he was coming for the one thing she had left to lose. Her hand moved to her stomach, to the tiny life growing there. 14 weeks. In 26 more weeks, this baby would be born. And if Brandon got his way, she'd lose her child the moment it entered the world. Claire looked around her small apartment, the sanctuary she'd tried to build. It felt like a prison now. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She pulled out her phone and stared at Michael's number for a long time before calling. He answered immediately. Claire, is everything okay? No, she said, and then she started to cry. Everything is falling apart. Where are you? Home. I'm coming over. Don't argue. Just send me your address. 20 minutes later, Michael sat in her living room while she told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. He broke into your apartment, Michael said when she finished. I can't prove it. He bribed your building super. I can't prove that either. Claire. Michael leaned forward. We can fight this. I'll hire you, the best family lawyer in New York. He'll win. Claire's voice was flat, defeated. Brandon always wins. He has money, connections, lawyers who can tie me up in court for years. By the time we get through all the hearings and depositions and motions, my baby will be born, and the moment that happens, he'll take custody. Not if we prove he's unfit. With what proof? Claire laughed bitterly. I have nothing. No recordings of his threats, no documentation of abuse. Just my word against his, and whose word do you think a judge will believe? The successful businessman or the woman who lied about being pregnant during divorce proceedings? Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then, there has to be something. Some evidence, some witness, something that proves what he's really like. Claire shook her head. I should have documented it. All those years of belittling comments and financial control and emotional manipulation. I should have been recording, saving emails, keeping a journal. But I didn't. I just survived it. And now I have nothing to show for it. She put her face in her hands. I'm going to lose my baby. And it's my own fault for not being smarter about protecting myself. Stop. Michael's voice was firm. This is not your fault. Brandon is an abuser. He's systematically isolated you, controlled you, and now he's trying to take your child. None of that is on you. But I can't fight him. Then we find another way. Claire looked up. What other way? Run away? Disappear? He'll just use that to prove I'm unfit. Michael stood, pacing her small living room. There has to be something. Some piece of evidence we're missing. some way to prove his real character. But as Claire sat in her apartment, 14 weeks pregnant and utterly defeated, she couldn't imagine what that might be. Brandon had won again, and this time he was taking everything that mattered. The legal papers arrived on Monday morning, delivered by a process server at Claire's office. Emergency petition for paternity in custody, 37 pages of legal language that boiled down to one thing. Brandon wanted full custody of their unborn child. Jessica met with Claire that afternoon, her face grim. He's alleging fraud, mental instability, and endangerment, Jessica said, sliding the documents across her desk. He's claiming you deliberately hid the pregnancy to manipulate the divorce settlement. He's requesting an emergency psychological evaluation, supervised visitation after birth, and primary physical custody. Claire stared at the words until they blurred. Can he actually do this? He can try. And honestly, Claire, he has some valid legal arguments. You did sign documents waiving claims to children while knowing you were pregnant. A judge could see that as deceptive. I was protecting myself. I know, but we need to prove that. We need evidence that you had legitimate reasons to fear telling Brandon about the pregnancy. Jessica pulled out a legal pad. Walk me through your marriage. Every instance of abuse, control, manipulation, everything. So Claire did. She talked for 3 hours, describing 14 years of slow erosion. How Brandon had convinced her to quit her job, telling her she didn't need to work. How he'd controlled all their finances, giving her an allowance for household expenses. How he'd belittled her interests, mocked her intelligence, made her feel worthless. But I never documented any of it, Claire finished. No recordings, no saved emails. I just lived through it. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Did you ever tell anyone? Friends? Family? A therapist? I stopped seeing my friends after we got married. Brandon said they were a bad influence, and I didn't start therapy until after I filed for divorce. What about work emails? From when you were still working? Anything that shows how he talked to you? Claire shook her head. I deleted everything when I quit my job. Fresh start, or so I thought. Jessica sighed. Then we're building a case on testimony alone. Your word against his, and given that you hid the pregnancy, I'm going to lose. I didn't say that, but we're fighting uphill. The hearing is in 6 weeks. You'll be 20 weeks pregnant by then. Very visibly pregnant. Brandon's lawyer will use that against you. Look at how she hid this for months, Your Honor. What else is she hiding? Claire felt nauseous. What do I do? Document everything from now on. Every text, every call, every interaction with Brandon. If he threatens you again, record it. If he shows up at your apartment, call the police. Build evidence that shows his current behavior. And in the meantime, we pray he makes a mistake. That night, Claire sat in her apartment and tried to figure out how to fight someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. Brandon had money for the best lawyers. He had connections throughout the city. He had Diane Porter, whose hourly rate was more than Claire made in a week. All Claire had was the truth, and the truth she was learning wasn't always enough. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Counting down the days until I meet my son or daughter. Hope you're taking good care of my baby. B. Claire's hands shook as she screenshotted the message and sent it to Jessica. Evidence. One small piece of evidence that showed his obsession with control. Another text came through. Amber is so excited to be a mother. She's already decorated a nursery, pink and blue. We're prepared for either. Are you? Claire blocked the number, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The next 3 weeks were a nightmare. Brandon called from different numbers. Work phones, friends' phones, burner phones. Always the same message. I'm coming for the baby. You can't hide. You're mine. Claire reported each call to Jessica, who documented them for the court file. But Brandon was careful, nothing explicitly threatening, just present, reminding her that he existed, that he was watching, that he had power over her life. At 16 weeks, Claire's pregnancy became impossible to hide. Her colleagues at the Garrison Collection started to notice, offering congratulations that felt like condolences. They didn't know about the custody battle, didn't know that every day brought her closer to potentially losing her child. Michael kept his distance professionally but checked in daily. How are you holding up? He'd text. Still standing? She'd reply. It was all she could manage. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold October morning. Claire, 18 weeks pregnant, invisibly showing, sat in family court next to Jessica. Across the aisle, Brandon looked confident and relaxed, Diane Porter beside him in a suit that probably cost more than Claire's car. The judge, a stern woman named Honorable Patricia Morrison, reviewed the files with an expression that gave nothing away. "Mr. Bennett," she said finally, "you're alleging that Ms. Bennett fraudulently concealed her pregnancy during divorce proceedings?" "Yes, Your Honor," Diane said, standing. "My client has evidence that Ms. Bennett was approximately 10 weeks pregnant when she signed documents specifically waiving claims to children from the marriage. This was a deliberate deception designed to manipulate the settlement." Judge Morrison turned to Claire. "Ms. Bennett, how do you respond to this allegation?" Jessica stood. "Your Honor, my client was fleeing an abusive marriage. She had legitimate reasons to fear disclosing the pregnancy to Mr. Bennett, as evidenced by his behavior since discovering it." "What evidence of abuse do you have?" Jessica presented the screenshots of Brandon's texts, the documentation of his calls, the building super's suspicious behavior. It looked thin on paper, circumstantial at best. Diane countered with character witnesses: Brandon's business partners, his priest, even Amber Sullivan, who testified that Brandon was excited to be a father and concerned about Claire's mental state. "She seems unstable," Amber said from the witness stand, her face the picture of innocent concern. "Brandon worries about her ability to care for an infant alone." Claire gripped the table as she so hard her knuckles went white. The hearing lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Judge Morrison announced her preliminary ruling. "I find there is sufficient evidence to proceed with a full custody hearing," she said. "However, given the concerning pattern of contact from Mr. Bennett, I'm issuing a temporary restraining order. Mr. Bennett, you are not to contact Ms. Bennett except through legal counsel. Violation of this order will result in contempt charges." Claire felt a small surge of relief. At least he couldn't call her anymore. But then Judge Morrison continued. "That said, Ms. Bennett's decision to conceal the pregnancy is deeply troubling. I'm ordering a psychological evaluation to determine her fitness as a parent. We'll reconvene in 3 months for the full custody hearing." 3 months. Claire would be 30 weeks pregnant by then, 10 weeks from giving birth, 10 weeks to prove she deserved to keep her own child. Outside the courthouse, Jessica tried to put a positive spin on things. "The restraining order is good. It limits his ability to harass you." But she ordered a psych eval. "Standard procedure in custody cases. Just be honest with the evaluator. Answer their questions truthfully. You have nothing to hide." Claire wanted to laugh. Nothing to hide except the crippling fear that she was going to lose everything. That evening, she returned to her apartment to find an envelope slipped under her door. No postage, no return address. Hand-delivered. Inside was a printout of an article from a legal blog. "How Courts Determine Parental Fitness. Red Flags Judges Look For." Highlighted in yellow. Deceptive behavior regarding pregnancy and parenthood. No note, no signature. But Claire knew who'd sent it. She called Michael. "I can't do this," she said when he answered. "I can't survive 3 more months of this." "Yes, you can. He's going to win. He's going to take my baby, and there's nothing I can do to stop him." "Claire, bae, I need to step down from my job." Silence on the other end. Then, "What?" "The psychological evaluator is going to ask about my employment, about how I got hired, about my relationship with you. And when they find out we knew each other before, that you gave me a job when I was desperate, it's going to look bad. Like I'm using you. Like I'm unstable and trading favors for survival. That's not what happened. But it's what Brandon's lawyer will say. And I can't let my problems destroy your museum. I'm stepping down, effective immediately." "Claire, no. Thank you for everything, Michael, but I need to fight this on my own." She hung up before he could argue. Sitting in her apartment that night, 18 weeks pregnant and utterly alone, Claire felt the last threads of hope begin to fray. She'd lost her marriage, lost her home, lost her financial security. Soon she'd lose her job. And if Brandon got his way, she'd lose her child. The only thing she had left was the truth. And in a system built on evidence and documentation, the truth wasn't enough. 3 days after stepping down from the Garrison collection, Claire sat in her apartment and realized she'd been approaching this wrong. She'd been trying to prove Brandon was abusive now. But what she needed to prove was that he'd always been this way, that her fear of telling him about the pregnancy wasn't paranoia, it was survival. And maybe, just maybe, she'd been documenting his abuse all along without realizing it. Claire opened her laptop, the same laptop she'd had for 8 years, through the entire marriage. The laptop Brandon thought she'd barely used because all she did was waste time on art blogs. She created a new folder, encrypted it with a password Brandon would never guess, her grandmother's maiden name from before he'd even known her, and labeled it insurance policy. Then she started digging, first her email. She thought she'd deleted everything when she quit her job, but email archiving meant nothing was ever truly gone. She searched for Brandon's name and found thousands of messages. Most were mundane, reminders about dinner parties, instructions for household tasks, but scattered among them were gems. From Brandon, 3 years ago. Claire, I don't care what your art history degree says. That painting is ugly and we're not hanging it in our home. Your taste has always been questionable. From Brandon, 4 years ago. I've reduced your household account to $800 a month. You've been overspending and it needs to stop. Ask me if you need anything extra. From Brandon, 5 years ago. Your friend Melissa called again. I told her you're busy. She's a bad influence and I don't want her in our lives. One by one, Claire copied the emails into her encrypted folder. Evidence of financial control, social isolation, belittlement. Next, she checked her phone's cloud backup. She'd gotten the new prepaid phone, but her old phone's data was still saved in the cloud, accessible through her laptop. Text messages. Hundreds of them. Brandon to Claire 2 years ago. Make sure Claire sees us together at the gala tonight. I want her to know about us. Wait, that text wasn't to her. It was to someone else, but it was in her backup because Claire's breath caught because she'd had access to Brandon's iCloud account. He'd set up their phones together years ago, linking them to the same family account to save money, which meant his texts backed up to the same cloud storage as hers. With shaking hands, Claire searched for texts between Brandon and Amber. The affair had started at least a year before the divorce, based on court documents. What she found made her sick. Brandon to Amber. My wife is so boring lately. All she does is mope around the house. I need someone who appreciates me. Brandon to Amber. Claire's getting suspicious. Make sure you don't call when she's around. Brandon to Amber. I'm going to divorce her soon. Just need to move some assets first so she can't take half. And there, one that made Claire's blood run cold. Brandon to Amber. The divorce is almost final. Once it's done, you and I can start our real life together. Maybe even have a baby. A real family, not this farce I've been living. Dated 6 months before Claire filed for divorce. He'd been planning this. Planning to leave her. Planning to start over with Amber. Planning to reduce Claire to nothing. But the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Her home security system. Years ago, when they'd lived in the brownstone, Claire had installed nanny cams. Not because they had children, but because she'd wanted to monitor for break-ins while they traveled. Brandon had forgotten about them. They were hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames. Claire had taken the cameras when she moved out, stored them in a box without thinking much about it. The footage was saved to a local hard drive. Now she pulled out of that hard drive and started reviewing files. Most were useless. Hours of empty rooms, their housekeeper, cleaning, Brandon working in his study. But then she found something. 6 months before the divorce, Brandon had brought Amber to their home while Claire was visiting her mother in Boston. The nanny cam in the living room had caught everything. Brandon on camera laughing, "This is where I live with my wife. Pathetic, right? She decorated it. All this boring art." Amber, "When are you going to leave her?" Brandon, "Soon. I'm moving money offshore first. Can't let her get her hands on everything I've built. She didn't earn it." Amber, "What if she fights the divorce?" Brandon, "She won't. Claire's weak. I made it sure of that. 14 years of making her feel worthless, and now she actually believes it. She'll take whatever scraps I give her and be grateful." Claire sat in her apartment, staring at the video footage, and felt something inside her shift. All this time, she'd thought she was crazy, thought she was paranoid for feeling controlled and diminished, thought maybe she really was the problem. But here was proof Brandon had systematically destroyed her self-worth, deliberately isolated her, intentionally made her feel worthless so she wouldn't fight back. And he'd admitted it on camera. Claire called Jessica. "I found something. You need to see this." The next day, Jessica sat in Claire's apartment reviewing the evidence with an expression of growing astonishment. "This is incredible," she said, watching the living room footage for the third time. "This is direct evidence of financial fraud, emotional abuse, and premeditated manipulation. Can we use it in court?" "Absolutely. The nanny cams were in your marital home installed for legitimate security purposes. New York is a one-party consent state for recording, and since you owned the property jointly, you had every right to record in your own home." Claire felt hope flutter in her chest for the first time in weeks. "So this proves why I hid the pregnancy?" "More than that, this proves Brandon was planning to destroy you financially long before you even filed for divorce. It proves he deliberately undermined your self-worth. It proves he's not a man who should have custody of a child." Jessica copied all the files, organizing them into a comprehensive evidence package. "We're going to file an amended response to his custody petition. And Claire, we're going on offense." The amended filing hit Brandon's lawyers 3 days later. Counter petition for full custody with evidence of abuse and financial fraud. Claire didn't have to wait long for the response. Her phone rang from an unknown number. Against her better judgment and Jessica's explicit instructions, she answered. "You think you're clever?" Brandon's voice was tight with rage. "Recording me in my own home? Our home, that I paid half the mortgage on. Those recordings are illegal. My lawyer says—" "Your lawyer is wrong. I checked with mine. Everything I recorded was legal, admissible, and damning." Claire felt strength rising in her voice. "You spent 14 years making me feel worthless, Brandon. But I wasn't worthless. I was just buried under your abuse. You're making a huge mistake." "No, marrying you was the mistake. Fighting back is the smartest thing I've ever done." She hung up. That night, Claire lay in bed with her hand on her stomach, feeling the first flutter of movement. 19 weeks pregnant, her baby was getting stronger, and so was she. The psychological evaluation took place over 3 sessions during the next 2 weeks. Dr. Patricia Wells, a clinical psychologist specializing in custody cases, asked Claire hundreds of questions about her childhood, her marriage, her mental health. "Why did you hide the pregnancy from your ex-husband?" Dr. Wells asked during the final session. Claire took a deep breath. "Because I was afraid he would use it to control me. He'd spent 14 years making me feel worthless and small. When I finally found the courage to leave, I was terrified that telling him about the baby would give him a new weapon to hurt me with." "And has he tried to use the pregnancy as a weapon?" "Yes." Claire pulled out her phone, showing the screenshots of Brandon's texts, the calls from multiple numbers, the threatening messages. "He's made it clear that he doesn't want to be a father. He wants to take my child away from me because losing the baby would destroy me." Dr. Wells reviewed the evidence quietly. "Thank you for your honesty, Claire." 2 weeks later, the psychological evaluation report arrived. Jessica called Claire immediately. "You're not going to believe this," Jessica said, and Claire could hear the smile in her voice. "Good news?" "Dr. Digger, Wells found you to be psychologically stable with appropriate protective instincts toward your child. She noted that your decision to hide the pregnancy, while unconventional, was a rational response to a pattern of abuse. She's recommending you for primary custody." Claire sat down hard. "Really?" "Really. And it gets better. Brandon's lawyer tried to challenge the findings, so the judge ordered Brandon to undergo a psychological evaluation too. Those results just came in. And Dr. Martin found Brandon to display narcissistic personality traits, poor impulse control, and an alarming tendency to view his child as property rather than a person. The evaluator recommended supervised visitation only, pending completion of parenting classes and anger management. For the first time in months, Claire allowed herself to hope. But she'd learned not to trust hope too easily. Brandon always had another move. She just didn't know what it would be yet. The blow came from a direction Claire never expected. 3 days after the psychological evaluation report, she arrived at the Garrison Collection to collect some personal items she'd left behind when she resigned. Thomas Sullivan met her at the door, his usually jovial face tight with concern. "Claire, I need to talk to you." "What's wrong?" "The board called an emergency meeting last night. They've been receiving calls from major donors. People are concerned about the museum's association with your situation." Claire felt ice form in her stomach. "My situation?" "The custody battle. It's been in the press. Someone leaked the details. The hidden pregnancy, the fraud allegations, the recordings. Donors are worried about the museum's reputation." "Thomas, I resigned. I'm not working here anymore." "I know, but the board is concerned that your continued association with Michael is affecting fundraising. They've asked him to distance himself from you." The words hit like a physical blow. "They want Michael to abandon me. They want to protect the museum. The opening is in 6 months. We have 50 million in pledged donations that are now at risk." Claire understood immediately. Brandon had done this. Somehow he'd gotten the custody case into the press, made her look unstable, made the museum look complicit in employing a woman who'd lied about being pregnant. "Where's Michael?" she asked. "In the board meeting. It's been going on for 3 hours." Claire left without collecting her things. That night, Michael called. She almost didn't answer. "Claire, please, let me explain." "There's nothing to explain. The board wants you to cut ties with me. I understand." "I told them no." Claire froze. "What?" "I told them that if they require me to abandon you as a condition of opening the museum, then we won't open the museum. I'll walk away from the whole thing." "Michael, you've spent 2 years planning this. Millions of dollars. You can't—" "Yes, I can, Claire. I've waited 15 years to have you in my life. I'm not losing you now because some donors are uncomfortable with you standing up to an abuser. But the museum will open when it opens, or it won't, but I'm not sacrificing you to make it happen." Claire felt tears streaming down her face. "You could lose everything." "What the everything, not the things that matter." But the board wasn't finished. 2 days later, they made their ultimatum official. Michael could keep the museum or keep supporting Claire, but not both. If he chose Claire, they would vote to delay the opening indefinitely and freeze all major donations. Michael chose Claire. The museum opening was postponed. Donors withdrew. 2 years of work effectively destroyed. And Claire, 21 weeks pregnant, felt the weight of it crushing her. She called Michael. "I'm going to step back, completely. No contact, no support, nothing. You can tell the board I'm out of your life." "Claire, no." "Yes, I won't let my problems destroy your dream. I'll fight Brandon on my own." "You don't have to." "Michael, please. I'm asking you to let me do this, for both of us." After a long silence, he said, "I'll respect your choice. But Claire, I'm not going anywhere. When you need me, I'll be here." She hung up before she could change her mind. That night, alone in her apartment, Claire felt the baby kick for the first time. A strong, definite movement. A reminder that she wasn't alone, even when she felt completely isolated. She put her hand on her stomach. "It's just us now," she whispered. "But that's okay. We're going to be okay." 2 days later, she started bleeding. The hospital room was too bright, too white, too cold. Claire lay on the examination table while the ultrasound technician moved the wand across her stomach, searching for a heartbeat. "Is the baby okay?" Claire asked for the 10th time. The technician's face was carefully neutral. "I need to get the doctor. Just stay calm." But Claire couldn't stay calm. She was 21 weeks pregnant, bleeding heavily, and terrified she was losing the one thing she had left. The doctor entered, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Sandra Hayes, and took over the ultrasound. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, Dr. Hayes smiled. "There's the heartbeat, strong and steady." Claire burst into tears. "The baby's okay?" "The baby is fine. You've had what we call a subchorionic hematoma, a small blood clot between the uterus and the placenta. It's resolving on its own. The bleeding should stop within a few days." "So I'm not having a miscarriage?" "No, your baby's perfectly healthy." Claire was released from the hospital 4 hours later with strict instructions to rest and avoid stress. The irony wasn't lost on her. Avoid stress while in the middle of a custody battle that threatened to take her child away. She took a cab back to her apartment, too tired to cry anymore. When she checked her phone, she had 17 missed calls, 3 from Jessica, 2 from Michael, who must have somehow found out, 12 from unknown numbers, and 1 voicemail that made her blood run cold. Claire, it's Amber. We need to talk. Call me back. It's about Brandon. Claire stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Whatever Amber wanted, it couldn't be good. But the next morning, as she sat in her apartment trying to figure out how to survive the next 3 months until the custody hearing, another message came through. This time it was a text with an attachment, a photo of a prenuptial agreement. Amber's name was on it, and the terms were brutal. In the event of divorce, Amber Sullivan receives $0. All children remain with Brandon Bennett, full custody. Below the photo, Amber had written, "We need to talk. He's doing to me exactly what he did to you." Claire stared at the message for a long time. Then slowly she typed back, "I'm listening." They met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere Brandon or his associates might see them. Amber arrived first, sitting in a corner booth with sunglasses on despite being indoors. When Claire walked in, 22 weeks pregnant and showing, Amber's eyes widened. "You're really pregnant," Amber said. "Yes." Claire slid into the booth across from her. "You said you wanted to talk about Brandon?" Amber removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were red, makeup covering what looked like recent crying. "I found the prenup 3 weeks ago, hidden in his office. I'm 4 months pregnant with his child, and if we get divorced, I get nothing. He keeps the baby, just like he tried to do to me. Exactly like he did to you." Amber pulled out her phone and showed Claire a series of text messages. "Look at these, Ba." Claire read them, her stomach sinking with each line. Brandon to his lawyer. "Once Amber gives birth, file divorce papers. I want full custody. She's just an incubator." Brandon to an unknown person. "I don't care about Claire's brat, but if I let her keep it, she wins. I'd rather see it in foster care than with her." Brandon to Amber's former friend. "Can you confirm Amber cheated on me? I need grounds for the divorce and evidence she's unfit." "He's been planning this for months," Amber said. "He promised me we'd get married, raise our children together. But it was all a lie. He's going to use me to get custody away from you, then discard me and take my baby too." Claire felt a strange mixture of emotions, vindication that she wasn't crazy, rage at Brandon's systematic cruelty, and unexpected sympathy for the woman across from her. "Why are you telling me this?" Claire asked. "You testified against me in court." "Because I was stupid and in love and thought I was special." Amber's voice was bitter. "I thought I was different from you, that Brandon loved me in a way he never loved you. But I was wrong. I'm just the next version of you. And when he's done with me, there'll be another girl after me. What do you want?" "I want to bury him." Amber leaned forward. "I've been recording him for 3 weeks, ever since I found the prenup. I have evidence that will destroy him." "What kind of evidence?" Amber pulled out a small recording device and pressed play. Brandon's voice filled the quiet coffee shop. "I'm not marrying you, Amber. The prenup makes that clear. You're having my baby, and then you're leaving. I don't care where you go or what you do, but my child stays with me." Amber's voice on recording. "You said you loved me?" Brandon, "I said what I needed to say to keep you compliant. Jesus, you're as gullible as Claire was. At least she had the excuse of being young when we met. You're just stupid." The recording continued, Brandon's voice cold and calculating as he detailed his plan. Use Amber's testimony to destroy Claire's custody case, then divorce Amber and use her unstable behavior to take custody of their child too. When it ended, Claire sat in silence. "I have 6 hours of recordings like that," Amber said, plus video of him bribing the court clerk, plus proof that he moved $400,000 to an offshore account to hide it from both of us. "Why haven't you gone to the police?" "Because I need immunity. I've been complicit in some of his schemes, the testimony against you. For one, I need the DA to agree not to prosecute me for perjury." Claire studied the woman across from her. A year ago, Amber had been her enemy. The other woman, the reason her marriage fell apart, or so she'd thought. Now she saw the truth. Amber was just another victim in Brandon's systematic destruction of anyone who got close to him. If I help you get immunity, Claire said slowly, will you testify against him? In my custody case? Yes, but I want more than that. I want to file my own custody case, and I want us to coordinate our legal strategy so he can't play us against each other. Claire pulled out her phone. I need to call my lawyer. Jessica was skeptical at first. Claire, she lied under oath. She can't be trusted. She has recordings of Brandon admitting to fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit parental kidnapping. She has video evidence. She has everything we need to win. And she wants immunity in exchange? Yes. Jessica was quiet for a moment. Let me call the DA. If Amber's evidence is as good as you say, we might be able to work something out. It took 2 weeks to negotiate, 2 weeks of careful legal maneuvering, of Amber meeting with prosecutors, of Jessica and Amber's hastily hired lawyer working together to craft a deal. Finally, the arrangement was set. Amber would receive immunity from perjury charges in exchange for full cooperation in the criminal investigation of Brandon Bennett. The charge, witness tampering, bribery of a court official, fraud, and conspiracy to commit parental kidnapping. The preliminary hearing was set for 3 weeks later. Claire would be 26 weeks pregnant. In the meantime, she had to survive. She'd moved to a cheap extended stay motel in New Jersey, unable to afford her apartment on the money she'd saved after resigning from the Garrison collection. The motel was depressing, but safe, or at least safer than anywhere Brandon knew about. She worked part-time at a small art gallery in Hoboken, paid in cash under the table. The owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Williams, didn't ask questions about why a pregnant woman needed off-the-books work. She just let Claire authenticate paintings and organize the backroom inventory. It was exhausting. Claire was on her feet 8 hours a day, her back aching, her ankles swelling. At night, she collapsed in the motel room and tried not to think about how far she'd fallen. From Brandon's penthouse to a motel room with a broken heater, from a prestigious job at a new museum to cash-only work at a dusty gallery, from married and secure to pregnant and alone. But she was surviving, and her baby was healthy. The ultrasound at 24 weeks had shown a perfectly developing fetus, 10 fingers and 10 toes, a heartbeat strong and steady. Do you want to know the sex? The technician had asked. Yes, Claire had whispered. It's a girl. A daughter. Claire was having a daughter. She lay in the motel room that night, hand on her stomach, and made promises to the tiny person growing inside her. I will protect you. I will fight for you. And I will make sure you never know the kind of cruelty your father is capable of. The baby kicked, strong and sure. Claire took it as our agreement. The custody hearing was scheduled for early December. Claire would be 30 weeks pregnant by then, 7 weeks from her due date. But first came the criminal charges. The day Brandon was arrested, Claire was at the gallery in Hoboken. Her phone rang. Jessica calling. Turn on the news, Jessica said. Claire pulled up a news website on the gallery computer. The headline made her gasp. Real estate mogul Brandon Bennett arrested on fraud and bribery charges. Below it, a photo of Brandon in handcuffs, being led from his office building by police. They arrested him this morning, Jessica said. The DA moved quickly once Amber provided the evidence. He's being charged with bribery of a court official, witness tampering, and fraud. They're still investigating the parental kidnapping charges, but those will likely follow. What does this mean for the custody case? It means we're in a much stronger position. A man under criminal indictment for trying to manipulate a custody case is not someone a judge is going to hand a baby to. Claire watched the video of Brandon being arrested, his face pale and furious as reporters shouted questions. She felt no joy, no triumph, just a hollow exhaustion. Is it over? She asked Jessica. Not yet, but we're getting there. That night, Claire received a single text from an unknown number. This isn't over. When I get out, you'll regret this. She forwarded it to Jessica and the police, then blocked the number. But she knew Brandon well enough to know he meant it. Men like him didn't accept defeat. They just got more dangerous. The full custody hearing began on a freezing December morning. Claire, 30 weeks pregnant and exhausted, sat beside Jessica in the family courtroom. Across the aisle, Brandon sat with Diane Porter, his face carefully neutral, despite the criminal charges hanging over him. He'd been released on bail, $500,000, paid within hours of his arrest. And now he was here, fighting for custody of a child he'd never wanted, purely to punish the woman who dared to escape him. Judge Morrison called the court to order. We're here to determine custody arrangements for the child of Claire Bennett and Brandon Bennett, due to be born in approximately 10 weeks. Mr. Bennett is seeking primary custody. Ms. Bennett is seeking full custody with supervised visitation for the father. Additionally, the judge continued, I've been made aware of the criminal charges against Mr. Bennett. Those charges will be considered as we evaluate his fitness as a parent. Diane Porter stood. Your Honor, my client maintains his innocence on all charges. The accusations stem from a conspiracy between his ex-wife and his former fiancée, both of whom have reason to fabricate evidence against him. Jessica rose to respond, but Judge Morrison held up a hand. I've reviewed the evidence presented to the criminal court. The recordings and financial documents appear authentic, but that's for the criminal trial to determine. Today we're focused on what's best for the child. The first witness was Dr. Patricia Wells, the psychologist who'd evaluated Claire. In your professional opinion, Jessica asked, is Ms. Bennett capable of providing a safe, stable home for her child? Yes, Wells said firmly. Ms. Bennett demonstrated appropriate protective instincts, realistic planning for the child's future, and a clear understanding of her responsibilities as a parent. Her decision to hide the pregnancy during divorce proceedings, while unconventional, was a rational response to a pattern of abuse and control. Diane's cross-examination was brutal. But Dr. Wells isn't lying about being pregnant a sign of instability, of someone who can't be trusted? In a vacuum, perhaps, but in the context of Ms. Bennett's situation, leaving an abusive marriage, fearing that disclosure would lead to further control and manipulation, it was a survival strategy. So you're saying lying is acceptable if someone is afraid? I'm saying that victims of abuse often have to make difficult choices to protect themselves. Ms. Bennett's choice to delay disclosure was motivated by legitimate fear, not deception. The second witness was Dr. Martin Foster, who'd evaluated Brandon. Mr. Bennett presents with narcissistic personality traits, Dr. Foster testified. He views relationships as transactional. During our sessions, he repeatedly referred to his unborn child as it, and focused primarily on how custody would affect his public image and his conflict with Ms. Bennett. Did he express any interest in actually parenting the child? Jessica asked. No, his primary concern was winning. He stated, and I quote, I need to show Claire she can't just walk away and take what's mine. So the child is property to him? That appears to be his framework, yes. Diane objected, tried to discredit the evaluation, but Judge Morrison overruled her. The damage was done. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Amber Sullivan's testimony. Amber took the stand, visibly pregnant at 7 months, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. Jessica approached gently. Ms. Sullivan, can you tell the court about your relationship with Brandon Bennett? We started seeing each other about 18 months ago, Amber said, her voice barely above a whisper. He told me he was unhappily married, that he was going to leave his wife, that we'd build a life together. And did you believe him? Yes, I was young and stupid and thought I was special. Amber's voice strengthened. He made me feel like I was the most important person in the world, until I found out I was just another pawn in his game. Jessica presented the prenuptial agreement. Can you explain what you found? This prenup gives me nothing if we divorce. It gives Brandon full custody of our child. I found it 3 weeks after I testified against Claire in the preliminary hearing. I realized then that he'd been using me to destroy her, and he was planning to do the same thing to me. What did you do when you made this discovery? I started recording him, every conversation, every threat, every admission. Jessica played the recordings. Brandon's voice filled the courtroom, cold and calculating, as he detailed his plans to manipulate both women, keep both children, and discard the mothers like garbage. The courtroom was silent when the recordings ended. Judge Morrison looked at Brandon with an expression of disgust. Mr. Bennett, is this your voice on these recordings? Brandon stood, his face pale. Your Honor, those recordings were obtained illegally. Answer the question. Is that your voice, Vio? A long pause. Yes. Sit down. Diane tried to salvage the situation. Your Honor, my client's private conversations recorded without his consent. New York is a one-party consent state, Jessica interjected. Ms. Sullivan had every right to record conversations she was part of, and the content of those conversations demonstrates a clear pattern of manipulation, control, and intent to use the legal system to punish his ex-wife. The judge turned back to Amber. Ms. Sullivan, why are you testifying today? Because I don't want to end up like Claire was, destroyed alone, fighting for a child that should rightfully be hers. And because I want my daughter to grow up knowing I had the courage to do the right thing, even when it was hard. You're having a girl? Amber nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. What do you hope will be the outcome of today's hearing? I hope Claire gets full custody of her daughter. I hope Brandon never gets the chance to hurt another woman or child. And I hope someday my daughter and Claire's daughter can grow up knowing they were protected by their mothers. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Morrison gavelled for silence. The final witness was Claire herself. She took the stand, 30 weeks pregnant, her belly so large she had to adjust her position to be comfortable. Brandon watched her with cold hatred in his eyes. Jessica asked the standard questions: her fitness as a parent, her plans for the baby, her support system. Then she asked the crucial question: Claire, why do you believe you should have full custody of your daughter? Claire took a deep breath. Because I love her. Not as a possession, not as a tool to hurt someone else, but as a person who deserves to be protected, cherished, and raised in a home free from manipulation and control. And what about Mr. Bennett? Do you believe he should have access to his daughter? Claire looked directly at Brandon for the first time. I believe every child deserves to know their father, but I also believe every child deserves to be safe. If the court determines Brandon can be that safe person after counseling, after proving he's changed, then yes, supervised visitation. But until he demonstrates he can love our daughter for who she is, not for what she represents in his battle against me, I can't risk her safety. Diane's cross-examination was vicious. Ms. Bennett, you lied about being pregnant during your divorce. You worked for a man who admitted to having feelings for you. You resigned from that book and are now working cash only at a small gallery. How is any of that stable? I made choices to protect myself and my child from a man who wanted to destroy me. Not all of them were perfect, but they came from love and fear and the desperate need to survive. That's not instability. That's strength. Strength? You're living in a motel. Because I spent every penny I had on lawyers to protect my daughter from a man who views her as property. Yes, I'm in a motel, but I'm safe, and so is she. Diane pressed on, but Claire held firm. She'd survived 14 years with Brandon. A hostile cross-examination was nothing compared to that. When both sides rested, Judge Morrison announced she would take the matter under advisement. I'll issue my ruling within 2 weeks. Until then, Mr. Bennett, you are to have no contact with Ms. Bennett. The restraining order remains in effect. Outside the courthouse, Jessica put a hand on Claire's shoulder. You did great in there. Did we win? I think so, but with judges, you never know until the ruling comes down. Claire nodded, too exhausted to feel anything. She was 30 weeks pregnant, emotionally drained, and running on fumes. But she'd testified. She'd told her truth. She'd stood up to Brandon in open court. Whatever happened next, she'd done everything she could. The ruling came down 8 days later. Claire was at the gallery when Jessica called. Claire, sit down. Just tell me. You won. Full custody. Brandon gets no visitation rights until he completes parenting classes, anger management, and a psychiatric evaluation. Even then, visits will be supervised. Claire sat down hard on a shipping crate. We won? You won. The judge cited the recordings, the psychological evaluations, and Brandon's criminal charges. She said, and I quote, Mr. Bennett has demonstrated a pattern of viewing his child as a weapon against his ex-wife rather than as a human being worthy of love and protection. Until he can prove otherwise, he poses a danger to the child's emotional and psychological welfare. Claire put her hand on her belly where her daughter was kicking. It's over? The custody fight is over. The criminal charges against Brandon are still ongoing. But yes, your baby is yours. Legally, fully yours. After she hung up, Claire sat in the dusty back room of the gallery and cried. Not sad tears, not scared tears, relief tears, victory tears, finally safe tears. Mrs. Williams appeared in the doorway. Good news? The best news, Claire said. Then take the rest of the day off. Go celebrate. Claire walked out into the December afternoon, 30 weeks pregnant, broke, living in a motel but with full custody of her daughter. And for the first time in months, maybe years, she felt truly free. Claire went into labor 3 weeks early at 37 weeks on a cold January night. She was alone in her motel room when her water broke, soaking through her clothes and the cheap carpet. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen. This was it. After 9 months of fear and fighting and surviving, her daughter was coming. She called 911, then texted Jessica. In labor, on way to hospital. The ambulance arrived within minutes. The paramedics were kind, professional, helping her into the vehicle while she breathed through contractions that were coming faster than she'd expected. Do you have someone we can call? One of them asked. Family? The father? No, Claire gasped. Just me. At the hospital, they checked her in quickly. 7 centimeters dilated. Moving fast, the baby would be here soon. A nurse helped her into a delivery room. Are you sure there's no one you want here? Claire thought of Michael. She hadn't spoken to him in months, not since she'd pushed him away to save his museum. He'd respected her wishes, given her space, but somehow she knew that if she called, he'd come. But this was her moment, her battle, her victory. I'm sure, she said, but Jessica had other ideas. Claire was 8 centimeters dilated, gripping the bed rails through a contraction, when she heard familiar voices outside the delivery room door. I don't care if visiting hours are over. My client is in labor and she needs support. Jessica's voice, fierce and determined. Sir, you can't just... A nurse protesting. I'm her emergency contact. I have every right to be here. Michael's voice, calm but unyielding. The door opened. Jessica entered first, looking disheveled and fierce. Behind her came Michael, holding flowers and looking terrified. You called him? Claire asked Jessica. Of course I called him. You're about to become a mother. You need people who love you. I told you I wanted to do this alone, and we're ignoring that very stupid decision. Jessica took Claire's hand. You've been alone enough. Let us be here for you. Michael stayed near the door, uncertain. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. But Claire, I've been waiting for this moment since the day you told me you were pregnant. Please let me stay. Claire looked at him, this man who'd given up his museum for her, who'd waited 15 years to have her in his life, who'd never asked for anything in return. Stay, she whispered. The next 6 hours were a blur of pain and breathing and pushing. Jessica held one hand, Michael held the other, and together they coached her through the hardest thing she'd ever done. At 4:47 a.m., Ruby Claire Bennett entered the world, screaming her fury at being born 3 weeks early. The doctor placed her on Claire's chest. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, perfectly healthy. Claire looked down at her daughter, red-faced, wrinkled, absolutely perfect, and felt something break open in her chest. All the fear, all the pain, all the months of fighting, it had all been for this tiny person. Hi, sweet girl, Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm your mom, and I promise you'll never know the kind of cruelty I did. You're safe, you're loved, you're mine. Ruby's cries softened, and she looked up at Claire with dark, unfocused eyes. Michael leaned in to look at the baby, his face full of wonder. She's beautiful. She is, Claire agreed. Jessica squeezed Claire's shoulder. You did it. You fought for her, and you won. Later, after the delivery room had cleared and Ruby was sleeping in a bassinet beside Claire's hospital bed, Michael pulled up a chair. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay? The museum board reconvened last month. After Brandon's arrest made the news, donors started calling again. They want the museum to open. They're ready to reinstate funding. Claire's breath caught. Michael, that's wonderful. They have one condition. They want you back as senior authentication specialist. Me. You, the woman who had the courage to fight a billionaire-backed abuser in court and win. The woman who documented evidence that put him in prison. The woman who is, incidentally, one of the best art authenticators in the country. Michael smiled. They want you, Claire, if you'll come back. Claire looked at Ruby, sleeping peacefully. I have a newborn. Full maternity leave, 6 months paid, daycare on site when you return, your own schedule, and Jessica vetted the employment contract personally, ironclad protections. Why are you doing this? Michael reached out and gently touched Ruby's tiny hand. Because 15 years ago, I watched you stand in front of a Vermeer and see beauty that no one else could see. And I thought, that's someone special. That's someone who deserves everything good in the world. I've waited a long time to be able to give you that. Michael, I'm not asking for anything in return. I'm not proposing marriage or declaring my undying love. I'm just offering you a job you're qualified for and a chance to rebuild your life. He met her eyes. What do you say? Claire looked at her daughter, at the man who'd never stopped believing in her, at the future that was suddenly impossibly opening up before her. Yes, she said. I say yes. 6 months later, Claire stood in the grand opening of the Garrison collection, Ruby in her arms, surrounded by some of the most important pieces of art in private hands. The museum was stunning. Light-filled galleries, carefully curated exhibitions, and at the center of it all, a new wing dedicated to recovered and authenticated masterworks, the fruits of Claire's work over the past month since returning from maternity leave. Reporters crowded around Michael for interviews. Donors admired the collection. Critics praised the vision. And Claire stood quietly in the Dutch Masters Gallery, in front of the Vermeer that had started it all, with her daughter sleeping against her chest. What do you think, Ruby? She whispered. Pretty beautiful, right? It is beautiful. Claire turned to find Michael approaching, looking relieved to escape the reporters. How are you holding up? He asked. Tired, happy, overwhelmed, all of the above. Welcome to parenthood. Michael smiled at Ruby. She's getting so big. 6 months old tomorrow. Time flies. They stood together in comfortable silence, looking at the Vermeer. After a moment, Michael said, I need to ask you something. Okay. Would you have dinner with me? With me? A real dinner, not a working dinner or a casual catch-up, an actual date. Claire looked up at him. This man who'd waited 15 years, who'd given up his museum for her, who'd held her hand through labor without expecting anything in return. I have a 6-month-old daughter, she said. I'm still healing from a custody battle that nearly destroyed me. I'm not ready for anything serious. I'm not asking for serious, I'm asking for dinner. One meal, no pressure, just 2 old friends finally getting the chance we missed 15 years ago. Claire smiled. One dinner, but I'm paying for myself. Deal. Ruby stirred in her arms, making small sounds of waking. Claire rocked her gently. You know what the best part of tonight is? Michael asked. What? Brandon isn't here to see it. He's sitting in prison, awaiting trial while you're here holding your daughter and celebrating your success. That's the real victory. Claire looked down at Ruby, who'd opened her eyes and was staring up at her mother with perfect trust. You're right, she said. This is the real victory. The evening ended late. After the museum emptied and the staff began cleaning up, Claire found herself alone in the gallery with Ruby. She walked slowly through the rooms, showing her daughter the paintings she'd authenticated, the history she'd uncovered, the beauty she'd helped preserve. Someday, she told Ruby, when you're older, I'll tell you about the year you were born, about how hard I fought to keep you, about the people who helped us survive, about the man who's taking your mom to dinner next week. Ruby grabbed Claire's finger, holding tight. But tonight, Claire continued, tonight we just celebrate. Because we made it, sweet girl. We're safe, we're home, and we're going to be okay. She kissed her daughter's forehead and walked toward the exit, ready to start the next chapter of their lives. 3 weeks after the museum opening, Claire received a call from the correctional facility where Brandon was being held. He wanted to see her. Jessica advised against it. You don't owe him anything. I know, but I think I need to do this to close this chapter completely. So on a gray February afternoon, Claire made the trip to Rikers Island, She left Ruby with Michael, who'd insisted on babysitting. Take all the time you need, he'd said. We'll be fine. The visiting room was exactly as depressing as she'd imagined. Fluorescent lights, plastic chairs, the smell of industrial cleaner, and despair. Claire sat at a table and waited. When Brandon was let in, she barely recognized him. 6 months in jail had aged him a decade. His expensive suits were gone, replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His perfectly styled hair was unkempt. His face was thinner, harder. He sat down across from her, picking up the phone on his side of the glass partition. Claire picked up hers. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." They sat in silence for a moment. Brandon looked like he wanted to say something cruel, something cutting, but the words didn't come. Finally, Claire spoke. "Why did you want to see me?" "To show you something." Brandon pulled out a document from the folder he'd been allowed to bring. He pressed it against the glass. Termination of parental rights. Claire's breath caught. "What is this?" "The DA offered me a deal. If I sign away my rights to both children, yours and Amber's, and agree to never contact either of you again, they'll reduce the charges. I'll do 8 years instead of 15. And you're taking it?" "My lawyer says it's my best option. I'm already facing bribery, fraud, and witness tampering charges. The parental kidnapping charges would add another decade." Brandon's voice was flat, defeated. "So yes, I'm signing." Claire stared at the document. Full termination. Brandon would have no legal rights to Ruby, no ability to petition for custody, no claim to visitation. Her daughter would be completely, legally, solely hers. "When?" she asked. "Tomorrow. The judge just needs your signature confirming you don't object." "I don't object." Brandon set the document down. "Did you ever love me?" The question hung between them. Claire thought about her answer carefully. "I loved who I thought you were, the man who seemed confident and successful and interested in me. But that man never existed, did he? He was just a character you played to get what you wanted." "Maybe." Brandon looked away. "Or maybe I loved you once and forgot how." "I don't think you ever knew how to love anyone but yourself." "You're probably right." He turned back to her. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Not for everything. I'm not that reformed. But for trying to take your kid. That was cruel, even for me." "Yes, it was." "The baby, is she okay?" Claire pulled out her phone and held it up to the glass, showing him a photo of Ruby. 6 months old, smiling, healthy, perfect. Brandon stared at the picture for a long moment. "She looks like you." "She does." "Good. She's better off without my genes anyway." He looked back at Claire. "I won't ask to see her. I won't fight the termination. When I get out in 8 years, I'll stay away. That's my promise to you. I'll hold you to it. I know you will. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." Brandon smiled, bitter and sad. "I spent 14 years trying to make you smaller so I could feel bigger. Turns out all I did was miss out on knowing someone remarkable." Claire felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "Goodbye, Brandon." "Goodbye, Claire." She stood to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I hope you use these 8 years to figure out who you actually are, not the character you play, the real you, because maybe that person is worth knowing." Brandon didn't respond. He just watched as she walked away. Claire didn't look back. The next day, she signed the termination documents in Jessica's office. Judge Morrison reviewed them, confirmed Brandon's signature, and made it official. "Ms. Bennett," the judge said, "you now have sole legal and physical custody of Ruby Claire Bennett, with no parental rights reserved for the biological father. Congratulations." Claire held the documents in shaking hands. It was over. Truly, completely over. "Thank you," she whispered. That evening, she celebrated with an intimate dinner at her new apartment, a 2-bedroom in a safe neighborhood affordable on her Garrison Collection salary. Jessica was there, toasting with sparkling cider. Michael was there, having successfully kept Ruby entertained all day. And Amber came too, holding her own daughter, Noah. "To Claire," Jessica said, raising her glass, "the strongest person I know." "To surviving," Amber added, "and to raising our girls to be stronger than we were." "To second chances," Michael said quietly, his eyes on Claire. Claire held Ruby in her lap and raised her own glass. To freedom, to safety, to building lives we actually want instead of lives we settled for. They clinked glasses, and for the first time in years, Claire felt at peace. Later that night, after everyone had left, Claire sat in Ruby's nursery and rocked her daughter to sleep. The room was simple but warm, painted soft yellow with curtains Michael had helped her hang and a bookshelf Jessica had built. You know what the best part of all this is? Claire whispered to Ruby. You'll grow up never knowing what it feels like to be small, never knowing what it's like to shrink yourself to fit someone else's ego. You'll just know love, safety, freedom. Ruby's eyes were closing, her tiny hand wrapped around Claire's finger. And someday, Claire continued, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you about the year you were born, about how hard I fought to keep you, about the people who helped us survive, about the man who held my hand through labor and never asked for anything in return. She looked out the nursery window at the Manhattan skyline, twinkling in the distance. I'll tell you that sometimes strength means running, not fighting. That survival is its own kind of victory. That being a mother means doing whatever it takes to protect your child, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Ruby's breathing had deepened into sleep. Claire stood carefully and placed her daughter in the crib, tucking a soft blanket around her. But tonight, she whispered, tonight we just rest, because we made it, sweet girl. We're home. She stood there for a long moment, watching her daughter sleep before walking to her own bedroom. On her nightstand was her phone, a text from Michael. How did it go today? Claire typed back. The termination is final. Ruby is legally mine. We're free. His response came immediately. I'm so proud of you. Sleep well. Then another message. Still on for dinner Friday? Claire smiled. Yes, but I'm still paying for myself. We'll see about that. She set the phone down and climbed into bed, exhausted but content. For 14 years, she'd lived in fear. Fear of Brandon's anger, fear of his control, fear of never escaping. But she'd done it. She'd fought back. She'd documented evidence. She'd made allies out of enemies. She'd survived a custody battle that could have destroyed her, and now, at 36 years old, she was starting over. Not the way she'd planned, not the fairy tale she'd imagined as a young woman standing in front of a Vermeer painting, but something better, something real, a good job, a healthy daughter, friends who'd stood by her, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance at the love story that had almost begun 15 years ago. Claire turned off the light and closed her eyes. Tomorrow she'd wake up to Ruby's cries. She'd make coffee and plan her day at the museum. She'd text Michael about their upcoming dinner. She'd continue building the life she'd fought so hard to win. But tonight she just slept. Deeply, safely, free. 1 year later, the Garrison Collection had become one of New York's premier museums, praised for its innovative authentication program and commitment to recovering lost artworks. Claire's work had been featured in art journals and documentaries. She'd been promoted to Director of Authentication, with a team working under her. Ruby was 18 months old, walking and talking, and absolutely fearless. She loved the museum daycare, where she could see her mother throughout the day and play with Noah, Amber's daughter, who attended the same program. Amber had rebuilt her life too. She'd gone to paralegal school, passed her exams, and now worked for Jessica's law firm specializing in family law. Together, she and Claire had started a support group for women leaving abusive relationships, sharing their stories and helping others find the courage to escape. We're not heroes, Amber often said at these meetings. We're just survivors who got lucky and are trying to pay it forward. Brandon was still in prison. Claire rarely thought about him anymore. He'd become a chapter in her history, not a presence in her present. And Michael had been patient. He'd waited while Claire healed, waited while she figured out who she was without Brandon's voice in her head, waited while she learned to trust again. They'd been dating for 6 months now, slow, careful, taking their time. Michael never pushed, never demanded, just showed up consistently, proving through actions that he was nothing like the man who'd come before. Ruby called him me, and loved when he visited, which was increasingly often. On a warm spring afternoon, Claire found herself back in the Dutch Masters Gallery, standing in front of the Vermeer. Ruby toddled beside her, holding her hand. Pretty, Ruby said, pointing at the painting. Yes, sweet girl. Very pretty. Michael appeared beside them. I've been looking for you two. We're admiring art. Ruby's developing good taste. Michael knelt down to Ruby's level. What do you think, Ruby? Should Mimi ask your mom a very important question? Ruby giggled. Yes! Michael stood and turned to Claire. I've been patient. I've waited 15 years and 6 months. I think it's time. Claire's heart started racing. Michael, will you? He paused dramatically. Let me take you both to Paris next month. For the Monet authentication you mentioned. All expenses paid, separate rooms, no pressure, just a beautiful city and great art and the two people I care about most. Claire laughed, relief and joy mixing together. You're terrible. I'm patient. There's a difference. He smiled. When you're ready for the real question, I'll ask. Until then, I'm happy being Mimi and taking you to dinner and supporting your brilliant career. Ruby tugged on Michael's pants. Hayes? The park sounds perfect. Michael looked at Claire. What do you say? We close in an hour. Want to get ice cream and let Ruby terrorize the playground? Claire looked at her daughter. Healthy, happy, safe. At the man who'd never stopped believing in her. At the life she'd built from the ashes of her old one. That sounds perfect, she said. They walked through the museum together, a family in all but name. Museum visitors smiled at them. The successful curator, her adorable daughter, and the kind billionaire who clearly adored them both. No one knew their history, the abuse, the custody battle, the prison sentence, the slow, careful rebuilding. And that was okay. Their story was theirs, private, sacred, hard-won. As they stepped out into the spring sunshine, Ruby between them holding both their hands, Claire felt something she'd never expected to feel again. Complete. Not because a man completed her, not because she'd found rescue or redemption, but because she'd saved herself, fought for her daughter, built a career, created a life worth living. Everything else, the museum, the job, the slowly blooming relationship with Michael, was just the reward for having the courage to survive. Look, Mama, Ruby pointed at a pigeon waddling past. Bird. Yes, sweet girl, bird. Michael caught Claire's eye and smiled. Happy? Yes, Claire said simply. I really am. And for the first time in her adult life, it was completely, utterly true. She was happy, she was free, she was home.